When we look at these bills, I think we cannot just look at S2992 in a vacuum. And I'm in part going to pick up on something Alex said earlier about how when we're talking about this, many of us have now gone to the bill's number, in part because the name keeps getting just that little bit mixed up. And some of why that name's probably getting a little bit mixed up is there's a very similar bill in the House with a very similar name that just switches the order of the words around a little bit. So part of this debate over antitrust is a debate more broadly about how should we be looking at competition policy. I would suggest that the consumer welfare standard has been an incredible tool. It has provided an objective standard that both allows large businesses to know what they are and are not allowed to do, focuses correctly on consumer protection, and has allowed intervention when there is a need for it in a way that can be described in court. What these proposals would do is shift away from that objective consumer welfare standard to something that creates a lot more burdens on businesses, but also has a negative impact on consumers by not focusing on their concerns and their needs. As I mentioned, this is part of a larger debate happening not only in the US, but we can also look at debates about what's going on in Europe, particularly with the Digital Markets Act that is looking to target largely American tech companies. Secondly, though, when we look at this specific bill, I think we also need to ask some questions about how it would operate, not only in the tech space, but in the future. While those platforms that would currently meet the thresholds are all large tech companies, there are some other companies that are not that far away from it. For example, Walmart also engages in a lot of these practices on their online platforms. Is there a reason that that self-preferencing is bad when it's from Amazon, but okay when it's from a different competitor? If the actual issue is this behavior, a lot of the questions that arise is why are we only focusing on a certain type of company? At the same time, there needs to be that step back to look at how does this behavior actually impact the consumers? Can our existing laws incorporate that into the consumer welfare standard without need for further intervention? And what might these changes mean for consumers? Because if this bill becomes law, we could see some very real changes for consumers. Everything from losing the Google Maps box at the top of search results when you look for restaurants nearby, to no longer knowing which products are eligible for quick free 2-day shipping under Prime, and having those easily accessible to consider that. Also, though, there are some other questions that seriously need to be addressed about these bills, particularly when it comes to data privacy and security. This came up repeatedly in the hearing, and I think it's very important that they not be dismissed, particularly because when you look at the polling, the tech policy issue most voters care about is their privacy and security online. So when we're looking at the antitrust acts, we have to consider what would this do for some of the protections that these companies are engaging in? How would this impact things like Apple's app tracking alerts to consumers, but also how would it impact the vulnerability of Americans' data more generally? Even if there is an affirmative defense, that affirmative defense very much places the burden on the company to prove that these are the reasons for the concerns. That's not sufficient when it comes to the fact that a lot of times foreign adversaries or other bad actors who are trying to get data are not going to declare themselves foreign adversaries or bad actors. They're going to make it more difficult on these companies to distinguish the good from the bad and to protect consumers and their data which is what is the most important to the consumers and voters today. So I think that when we're looking at these bills, our questions shouldn't just be, how does this impact the big tech companies? It should be, how does this impact innovation more generally? And particularly, how does this impact the American consumer as well? I think it's important to recognize this is a 10-year designation by the Federal Trade Commission. Think about where these companies were 10 years ago. Think about if we had been having this debate 10 years ago, what tech companies would have been talking about. This is a very dynamic market that we are looking at putting very heavy restrictions on a company where the market may move and change by the time that designation goes away. So are we going to be handicapping a company from competing in a certain way while the market evolves? I think it's important to consider how long that designation is, how much things are changing, how we're seeing new competitors already arise to many of these companies. I mean, the Facebook news was brought up, so I feel that we have to talk about, to some degree, while we're seeing Facebook and the stock response, we're also seeing incredible growth from a new competitor, TikTok, that did not even exist on many of our radars 18, 24 months ago. So these remain very dynamic companies. And I think we really have to consider what this heavy-handed degree of market intervention would do, especially when you consider the length of time these designations can last. I do think it's also important when we're talking about S2992 to remember this bill did not have a hearing. This bill did not have a further gathering to ask some of these difficult questions that were expressed by members on both sides of the aisle about the impact on security and privacy type of concerns. If you watch the Senate markup, it was clear that even the members that were voting to advance it many times would say, I'm voting to advance it, but I have serious concerns. Or I'm voting to advance it, but I think it needs amendments. Or I'm voting to advance it, but I'm not ready to vote for it on the floor. While the House may have conducted an investigation, when we talk about the Senate bill, we haven't seen that normal procedure followed to get an answer to some of these very difficult questions that I think many members on both sides of the aisle want to answer to truly understand the impact that this may have on the market. So a lot of this goes to the questions around the interoperability elements of the bill and the requirements of these platforms to allow others access to particularly certain types of user data. While there have been some attempts to provide affirmative defenses, I think there's a lot of concerns about how this could be abused, particularly when you look at the history of what have been those kind of data privacy, data security breaches that have given Americans a lot of concerns. And you look at something like Cambridge Analytica, which is basically a researcher abusing data access privileges, we can understand why Americans may be concerned about this and why many companies are taking steps to make their data more secure. This could make it more difficult, or at least raise questions when a company wants to invoke this defense of what burden do they have to prove that they're actually trying to do what their users want, what consumers want when it comes to providing better data and security. And when we're not necessarily talking about just an unscrupulous competitor, but someone who may be trying to get data on Americans or on our allies from a potential foreign adversary. This putting these additional regulatory requirements on these companies, preventing them from being able to innovate and serve consumers in the way they see best fit, may hurt their competitiveness more globally. They may, if they have these regulatory requirements that that other companies are not subject to, they may not be able to provide an American alternative to other global competitors. At the same time, I think there's also some questions about the fact that some of the requirements may not impact foreign companies in the same way. And again, that was raised in the hearing as well. I'm sorry, in the markup, because there wasn't a hearing.